public session. And I want to just remind people, please, members and guests, to make sure that their mobile phones are switched off. The purpose of this evening's engagement is to meet with members of the Commission on the Future of Policing to discuss its recent report on the future of policing in Ireland. We are joined by Ms Kathleen O'Toole, Chairperson of the Commission, and I want to thank you personally and on behalf of the committee for the very significant effort that you have made to be with us here today. We're also joined by Sir Peter Fahy, Chair of the Commission Working Group on the dual role, i.e. state security and civil policing. You're very welcome, Peter. By Helen Ryan, Chair of the Commission Working Group on Leadership and Structures. You're very welcome, Helen. And by Professor Donnacha O'Connell, Chair of the Commission Working Group on Governance, Oversight and Accountability. You're all very welcome indeed. And I'd like to also extend a welcome to those of your colleagues in the Visitors' Gallery here in Committee Room 3 this evening. I have to, first of all, before inviting Ms O'Toole to make her opening statement, to draw your attention to the situation in relation to privilege. Please note that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members should be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I now invite Ms O'Toole to please make her opening statement. Thank you.
Caoimhghín, thank you very much to you and the committee members for inviting me to meet with you today to discuss the Commission's report and to share the rationale behind our recommendations. I'm joined, as you mentioned, by my other colleagues, Sir Peter Fahy, who was former Chief Constable of the Greater Manchester Police, Helen Ryan, who's a well-known Irish consultant and former CEO, and Professor Donnacha O'Connell from NUI Galway. As you know, the Commission was tasked to undertake a fundamental review of policing in Ireland. We saw our role as charting a vision for the future, which would be rightfully ambitious for Irish policing and which would anticipate future challenges given changes in society, criminality and technology. However, we recognized at an early stage in our work that the vision would also need to be grounded in the reality of some significant challenges, both for An Garda Síochána as an organization and for the system as a whole. The shortcomings we encountered in the course of our work are not merely or even mainly a question of resources. They are critical systemic problems related to culture, structures, accountability mechanisms, and management processes. There is an urgent need for comprehensive fundamental change. We respectfully suggest that the implementation should be a first-order national priority. We have been encouraged by the initial response to our report by the Garda Commissioner, by individual members of An Garda Síochána, by government and others, including several members of this committee. The announcement in the recent budget of specific financial commitments to the transformation process, the rollout of the IT mobility project and training needs is very welcome. I know that a detailed consultation process is underway at present with the Garda Commissioner and the relevant agencies and government departments. Of course, this committee will also have a key role in informing the government's views on our recommendations. How our recommendations are implemented is ultimately a matter for government and the Oireachtas. I am, however, more than happy to share with you today the context of the recommendations we made and to answer any questions you may have. Committee members will be familiar with much of the detail of the report, and you will also be aware of our view that it should be implemented as a holistic reform package, given the interdependence of key recommendations. Before we move on to our discussion, Caoimhghín, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some insights into the recommendations and highlight some of our key elements. First, at a fundamental level, given the purpose of policing is to protect human rights of all members of society to live free from violence, abuse, crime, and fear, we have recommended that An Garda Síochána should have a human rights strategy and a human rights unit within the organization to develop, implement, and monitor that strategy. We also proposed a new approach to policing and community safety, which will ensure police are more visible in communities and can focus on preventing harm as distinct from a reactive approach. I understand that the committee's deliberations this term have a particular emphasis on community policing, and you have recently heard a detailed presentation on our proposals in this critical area from Dr. Johnny Conley of the University of Limerick, who was also a member of our commission. In summary, we've recommended a new overall structure for An Garda Síochána, which aligns the organization with the core ethos of policing, which is service to the community and working with communities. We have recommended an approach at district level which makes local communities the central focus of An Garda Síochána to ensure that Gardaí are more visible on the front line. We proposed a new definition of policing to include the concept of community safety and a stronger emphasis on harm prevention. We have also recommended that other agencies will work with the police in multidisciplinary teams to protect people and prevent crime, and that communities should be formally consulted on how their local areas are policed. I am pleased that the emphasis in our report on the need for stronger interagency cooperation has been welcomed. We saw clear evidence during our consultation process of the frustrations and the gaps in service to the community that can arise where the work of the Gardaí and other key agencies intersects. As we are all aware, in many circumstances, Gardaí are likely to be among the few public servants on duty outside of normal hours. We have therefore recommended that interagency cooperation should be underpinned by sharing information with the appropriate safeguards about persons identified as being at risk. We have also renewed a recommendation made in 2009 in a joint report by the Mental Health Commission and An Garda Síochána for multidisciplinary crisis intervention teams, multi-agency crisis intervention teams. The objective being that the police and other concerned agencies should be well equipped to handle mental health crises together. Police also need to be trained in the necessary special response techniques required in incidents involving vulnerable individuals. Also, we made several recommendations to deliver a professional, ethical, modern, and effective police service. Ireland deserves this. It should be the department should be, the police organization should be a professional service that's well managed, cost effective, and properly trained and equipped. The people of An Garda Síochána are its greatest resource. We say that very clearly in our report, that policing should be seen and see itself as a profession. This carries solid implications. A professional police service requires proper qualifications, robust training, continuous professional development, commitment to a code of ethics, clear policies, high standards of service, accountability, and a culture of continuous improvement. Our report includes important, substantive recommendations in all of these areas. It's vital that An Garda Síochána fosters psychological safety within the organization and an environment in which people at all levels of the organization feel able to share ideas on challenges, opportunities, problems, without fearing retribution or marginalization. This new culture must start from the top of the organization and be embedded at all levels. Our recommendations include a new approach to recruitment and will mean one Garda organization reflecting the full diversity of Irish society with sworn and non-sworn members part of a single workforce with a shared mission. We also have endorsed recommendations by the Garda Inspectorate on new entry routes at more senior levels in the organization, and we have recommended recruitment of staff with the necessary specialist, technical, and other skills. We have recommended a new approach to education in partnership with higher education institutions, no longer confined to Temple Moore. We have also recommended a flatter structure than currently exists, with much greater scope for local decision-making, new ideas, and innovation. An Garda Síochána must develop effective management processes supported by technology. We have also been clear about the capacity and skills we believe are required in senior leadership to drive the necessary reforms and to run the police organization effectively and efficiently. At a fundamental level, we recommended that the Garda Commissioner and leadership team should be empowered to manage the organization so that it can be truly accountable for delivery of its objectives. To strengthen the internal corporate governance and management of the police organization and ensure efficient use of resources, the Commission has recommended that An Garda Síochána should have a statutory board. The purpose of the board is to strengthen the governance and accountability of the organization. The board will hold the Commissioner and senior management to account for the effective performance of their responsibilities. Its establishment would provide a more appropriate framework of governance between the Department of Justice and Equality and An Garda Síochána than currently exists. This fact was endorsed by the Independent Effectiveness and Renewal Group chaired by Padraig O'Riordan in its second progress report published last month in the context of the structural and governance reforms now being undertaken in the Department of Justice and Equality. The Commission's recommendation for a statutory board simply makes sense. It is Corporate Governance 101, a term used by one Irish governance expert earlier this year in the context of the restoration of the board of the HSE. It is not a substitute for oversight of policing in Ireland, as some commentators have claimed. Caoimhghín, I want to be certain that this committee is fully informed in relation to our recommendations on oversight. The Commission's report does not recommend the abolition of the policing authority or its functions. It does not recommend the abolition of GSOC or undermine an effective independent complaints mechanism. It does not recommend or imply any dilution of oversight or scrutiny of policing. On the contrary, the Commission's report explicitly recognizes the unique nature of policing and the importance of independent oversight in that context. We recommend combining and expanding the work of the Policing Authority and the Garda Inspectorate, harnessing these resources under a single umbrella oversight body, which we have suggested could be called the Policing and Community Safety Oversight Committee. It could just as easily be called the Policing and Community Safety Authority. The report is clear that the functions of this body would involve transparent scrutiny of policing, included through public meetings with An Garda Síochána, the opportunities presented by social media, and other forms of meaningful engagement. The responsibilities will also include an enhancement of the inspection function, a focus on benchmarking professional standards of policing, and a role in promoting the interagency cooperation we believe to be central to the transformation of policing in Ireland. These functions are all set out in Chapter 13 of our report. We have recommended that the responsibility for appointments, including senior appointments within An Garda Síochána, should move to the responsibility of the organization itself under the leadership of the Commissioner and the scrutiny of the board. Our view, as set out in the report, is that it is not appropriate for an agency responsible for oversight to also have responsibility for managing appointments. It compromises the ability of that agency to oversee and scrutinize with complete independence. This is especially problematic when it comes to making senior appointments. The report makes it clear that what we envisaged is a clear, transparent process for such appointments, carried out in line with current common practices in the public sector here, which usually involves the Public Appointments Service or other expert recruitment organizations. This is not a regressive step. Also, and as we set out in the report, the oversight body, the Policing and Community Safety Oversight Commission, would have a defined and independent oversight role in making judgments on the integrity and effectiveness of this process. The Commission's proposals for reform of GSOC would significantly strengthen that organization as an independent and effective complaints mechanism. Under the Commission's proposals, GSOC would be renamed. This is not strictly a cosmetic change. Its purpose is to ensure no doubts about its independence from the Garda organization. Likewise, to underscore its independence, the head of the organization would become the accounting officer. This function would no longer rest with the Department of Justice as it does now. In addition, the new complaints body will carry out all investigations itself. This means that police will no longer be investigating themselves, as is now often the case. It will investigate incidents as well as individual actions so that any broader lessons for the organization can be identified. It will assess all complaints received and make a timely determination whether the complaint is a performance management issue. If this is the case, it will refer the issue back to An Garda Síochána to be addressed appropriately under performance management processes, which also require reform. In the context of oversight and the proper exercise of accountability for policing, we also respectfully recommend a structured program of meetings between this committee and An Garda Síochána. We hope that such an approach will also enhance the accountability system. Overall, our proposals in this area respond in large part to the recommendations set out in this committee's report on oversight produced earlier this year. In summary, we believe the time has come to make a clear distinction between, on one hand, the internal governance of the police organization for which An Garda Síochána and its commissioner must be responsible, and the roles of the Department of Justice and the oversight bodies whose independence must be, without question, in order to ensure their effectiveness. Let me stress that this approach enhances both overall accountability of the police and the role of oversight bodies to investigate and scrutinize independently how police exercise their responsibility. Finally, before I conclude, I'd like to reference the Commission's proposals on national security. As we all know, the main threat to national security in the past has come from domestic groups. That threat has not disappeared and remains the source of concern, particularly in the Brexit context, combined with the non-operation of political structures in Northern Ireland. Today, however, the nature of threat to national security is changing. Many places that in the past have not seen themselves as targets for international terrorists have suffered attacks. The means employed by terrorists have also changed as social media and the internet are used to plan attacks, radicalize impressionable minds, and recruit operatives. Against this backdrop, the commission was of the view that the national security function should not be lodged entirely within the police organization. We considered carefully whether to recommend the creation of a separate agency with powers going beyond analysis and intelligence coordination, but we are not convinced that this is either necessary or realistic at the present time. However, in light of the changing threats to national security, we believe that it is vital now that security intelligence should be coordinated at a national level. This is also relevant in a context where it is increasingly important for Ireland to engage in security cooperation with international partners. We therefore recommended the establishment of a Strategic Threat Analysis Center at central government level, headed by a National Security Coordinator. The STAC, that's the acronym of course, would answer to the Department of the Taoiseach. It would bring the various relevant agencies of the state together to pool expertise and information and produce a comprehensive picture of the threats to the state. It would provide a permanent structure to support the work of the National Security Committee and Cabinet Committee F and the development of a national security strategy. We have recommended that An Garda Síochána should retain operational responsibility for national security and a ring-fenced budget for its security and intelligence capability to enable the necessary recruitment of specialist expertise. Our report also has important recommendations on cybersecurity. Across the world, as we all know, government entities and private companies experience attempts to hack into their systems every day. Irish government institutions, infrastructure, and companies are all at risk from such cyber attacks, as are the many foreign companies that are based in Ireland and important to this nation's economy. We recommend the early formulation of an updated and comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy. Ireland also needs to develop its capacity to address the threat both within An Garda Síochána and in the National Cybersecurity Center, expanding work with academia and the private sector. This is a matter not only of resources but also of the security apparatus of the government. The National Security Coordinator should therefore also be responsible for the National Cybersecurity Center. Some of the submissions received by the Commission called for a single oversight framework for policing and security, a single pair of eyes. I understand that this is an issue which this committee has also discussed. However, our recommendations are based on an analysis of international oversight arrangements for security and also recognize that the security function of An Garda Síochána sits within a much broader state security framework. This will be reinforced by the establishment of the Strategic Threat Analysis Center. We recommend the appointment of an independent examiner of terrorist and serious crime legislation with powers to assess the conduct of security operations and to maintain a continuous review of how security legislation is being implemented by police and other agencies. In conclusion, I would say that trust and consent of the people form the bedrock of an effective police service. My sense is that Ireland has done well, despite the challenges of recent times, to retain positive community support and relationships. However, community support and trust cannot and should not ever be taken for granted. This is my final engagement as chair of the Commission, and it's been a great privilege to work with such an exceptional group of colleagues on a transformative program for Irish policing at such a critical time. Already, I see great commitment by stakeholders to making it happen once and for all. There will no doubt be hurdles ahead in implementation and delivery, but if all involved on Garda Síochána, the government, the Oireachtas, the policing oversight bodies really get behind a shared vision, it will succeed. The vital role of individual members of Garda Síochána and their staff associations in this process cannot be underestimated. We believe it absolutely can be done. Indeed, it must be done in the interests of Garda Síochána and the people they serve. I look forward now, Caoimhghín, to discussion with committee members. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. O'Toole, and thank you for a very comprehensive opening statement, which is hugely valuable in the preparation of members' individual contributions. I just need to check, Deputy Clare Daly, we spoke just before the commencement of the meeting. Had you an interest in being taken early because of other responsibilities? No. Fine. Deputy Donegal O'Leary then is the only one so far, and followed by Deputy Jim O'Caoláin, please. And if you want to indicate, just please do. All right.
Okay, Gurmagus Carela agus Gurmila Maguf as Fen Shaw agus Gurmila Maguf Clare as number thought into Guf. I suppose firstly, I think this is a very strong report. I think there is a great deal in it that will be of value to policing in Ireland. There's many things in this report that I agree with, and a great deal of them which fit quite closely with what we recommended in our own Sinn Féin submission. Things like the Police and Community Safety Act, prevention of harm as a core objective of policing, the importance of local policing for legislation on search and detention powers, entry pathways to the Gardaí, establishment of human rights units, and functions, non-core Gardaí functions being carried out by variously the court service, the prison service, INIS and so on. These are all very important things on which I am in agreement. I want to emphasise that because given that my time is limited, much of my questions will necessarily focus on areas where I might have a different view or some reservations in relation to the committee's recommendations. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe it is a good report, a valuable report and a great public service, which I want to see implemented. So I just wanted to make that clear at the outset. I suppose the first point I want to raise is, and I discussed it with Dr. Johnny Connolly here recently, was in relation to community policing. And I suppose I'll deal with this briefly enough, but I'm not entirely convinced of the approach in relation to, I appreciate very much the emphasis on community policing and the district policing model, but I'm not entirely convinced by this approach of all Gardaí to be considered community Gardaí. Personally, yes, absolutely, these sorts of policing with the community should run from top to bottom of Garda Síochána's institution, but I'm very much a believer in the function of a designated role within districts and divisions, or districts particularly, that they would be the key liaison person between the community and Garda Síochána. So, I suppose just at the outset, if I could get a comment on that. I know that there is some talk that there would be a team there and different people would have different responsibilities. I think that works reasonably well on the Garda side. My concern is, do the community know who the person to pick up the phone is? Because currently, where this model is working well, I appreciate it's not working well everywhere. I pay tribute to the guards in Cork. I think they've protected the model better than most places from what I've heard elsewhere. But where the community knows who the local community guard is, that makes a big difference. It develops trust, relationship and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure how well that's going to be maintained under the model that's proposed.
Thank you, Deputy. I really appreciate the fact that you brought that up because it gives us an opportunity to clarify. And I did discuss this with Dr. Johnny Conley, and I actually believe that we're more in agreement than disagreement here. We don't envisage that there would no longer be specialist community policing people. But there will still be, in our model, there would still be specialists assigned to community policing that would engage regularly with informally with members of the community, participate in multidisciplinary teams, organize community police meetings, be there to answer the phone when specific questions about community policing arise. But we feel that every police officer assigned to a particular district at the local level also needs to embrace the philosophy of community policing, that even those people that are getting 999 calls need to understand that they have a responsibility to prevent and intervene. It's not just about reaction. It's not just about enforcement. We found that in studies elsewhere, data show that policing, less than 20% of police work relates in any way to law enforcement, and most of it requires providing service to people in need, particularly vulnerable people. So we just think it's very important that it be embedded in the culture of An Garda Síochána that all members, particularly those at the local level, have a responsibility to the community, to engage with the community, and to help the community solve problems. So if I'm a police officer that's ordinarily assigned to a unit that's taking 999 calls, I'm not just going to react to calls for service, but if I have time in between, I'm going to get out, I'm going to visit people living and working in the neighborhood, I'm going to engage with them, I'm going to learn who they are and what their problems are, what their challenges are, how I can be helpful to them. So again, we're talking more about a culture of community policing throughout the organization, but we're not suggesting for a minute that specialist positions in community policing be eliminated in our model. So I hope that clarifies.
We're also saying for that shift to occur, the organisation has to be restructured with a fundamental shift of power and responsibility down to the local level, away from the headquarters. Also freeing up Garda Síochána from lots of tasks which are not police tasks, because generally what happens is community policing gets squeezed out because of exactly all the other duties. And essentially you have to, as an organisation, to take those out to free up the time, and then you need the systems like the performance systems which say that that relationship with the local community, the problem solving, the working with other agencies is what is really valued by the organisation, rather than, for instance, simplistic statistical targets. So, the whole thing has to fit together in terms of our report, of a whole series of measures which signal to the organisation it is that local relationship and that local problem solving and that ability to respond to local need. And you can only respond to local need if the power is pushed down so that local commanders absolutely understand that their key answerability is to local people and local elected members.
Okay. There's also an additional issue in relation to esteem, that if it's a designated function, it may be merely a designated function. And from speaking with regular members of An Garda Síochána, it was very clear to us that in order for community policing to be taken seriously within the organisation of An Garda Síochána, that it had to be identified as essentially the preeminent purpose of policing.
Okay. Very good. I suppose I'm a small bit clearer there, but I suppose I'll take that on board and consider further as ongoing discussions on legislation. So on. I suppose I'm going to come now just to what I think is probably my biggest concern. I think you've probably...
Keep going.
All right, okay. Yeah, all right. Look, my primary concern, right, and I'm sure it's probably the same with others, relates to recommendation 1712 and also to degree 16, and that's in relation to the change in structures and I understand, I'll be brief as I can, I understand the argument that's made in relation to governance and oversight. I note the the footnote from Dr. Vicky Conway and Dr. Eddie Malloy, I won't read it all, but the last sentence, we believe that the solution should be to adequately empower the policing authority while encouraging maturation of the culture of An Garda Síochána concerning external accountability. That would be my own initial view as well, I have to say. Now, I'm open-minded on this and I listen to the arguments that are made, but it seems to me that with the best will in the world, and even with independent appointments to the Garda board, over time, over probably not a very long period of time, the institutional loyalty of that board will be to An Garda Síochána rather than to their primary responsibility being the policing authority, their primary function being the oversight of An Garda Síochána. Now, and then I also appreciate that the PSC-SOC structure, the combined inspectorate and policing authority, their responsibility for oversight. But to me, what's to prevent An Garda Síochána disregarding what that body says, given it doesn't have the same powers over it that the policing authority did and would have in terms of appointments, in terms of the ability to approve policing plans rather than simply being consulted on them, which is my understanding of the recommendation as it is. So it seems to me that things are being moved around, right, and I understand that there's not abolition, right, and that there's mergers and restructuring, but I would be concerned that the Garda board isn't going to offer oversight. It's just for governance, or perhaps some level of accountability. But ultimately, will be quite closely tied to An Garda Síochána. Meetings won't be in public, if I'm understanding that correctly. Whereas you have an the PCSOC, which is responsible for oversight, but doesn't have any powers in which to move An Garda along. All it has is the powers of exposure, the same, I suppose, as we have, and to shine a light on. I think those things were important. The ability in terms of approval of policies, oversight of budget, approval of policing plans, and I think crucially appointments.
Just I'm sorry, but a very brief reply, Mr. Toole, because unfortunately we're going to have to suspend for just a few minutes to allow members to vote in the Dáil before the vote has been called. If you would like to give just a short response, and we can come back to...
Would it be better to hold the response even altogether? Like, there's probably a few minutes gone already.
If you wish, whichever...
It's called 1827. So there's 4 minutes gone.
27, that's 4. Well, we're halfway there.
Okay.
4 minutes. Yep. If you wish to give, and if you wish to add to it, we return as you decide.
It's entirely up to you, Caoimhghín.
Well, I'm in your hands. Members, what do you think?
Yeah, and even, to be honest, if you're interested, I mean, I'm prepared to say not to bother voting and stay here, because I think it's that they've been waiting so long already this evening.
Yes, you know what? Yeah.
You're okay with that?
Yeah, I'd be the same actually.
Yeah, let's do
that.
Yeah.
So carry on, yeah.
How big is the whip?
Well, if anyone wants to go, you should go, you know.
Can you carry on?
I think I can. I'll clear it, but I think it should be okay if to stay.
Well, fair play.
There's more than enough.
If we can come to that agreement, I'm willing to continue.
Yes, me too. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, look at that.
Well, then let's
very
continue.
Good.
Let's continue.
Well, we'll continue. I think if there's a gap between the government and the opposition, I think you've done very well, Deputy Brophy.
Yeah, I think that's...
You played your cards very well there.
I got 4 for 1.
Camp, you're all right.
Well, we're now entirely in your hands.
Thank you, Caoimhghín. Please. Please know that we have great respect for the democratic process, and also a few of us at the table are quite accustomed to unexpected developments in the workplace. So we're very patient and willing to stay as long as needed. I'll start by responding as one who's served as a police chief previously, and I'm sure Peter will have something to say about this. But then I'll turn over the discussion to Donica, whose subcommittee specifically tackled this issue. We come up through the ranks of policing, in North America, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, and we're focused primarily on being good police officers and good detectives. And suddenly, some of us rise to the ranks of chief and commissioner, without the benefit of a lot of education or experience in management and budget and other issues that are other experience that's required to manage a huge organization. And Garda Síochána, of course, with approximately 16,000 people and a 1.6 billion annual operating budget. So there's desperately a need not only to build capacity internally, to bring people internally who have the appropriate business acumen to assist the commissioner and his team, but also we feel that the board proposal would be particularly beneficial because it would bring people from different disciplines, people who understand budgets and HR issues and IT issues and those very important requirements for an organization that a commissioner or a career police person may not necessarily have a lot of experience in. So I thought that the board idea was a brilliant idea, to be honest, from a police chief's perspective, but I wouldn't expect it at all to be a cozy relationship. I would hope that there'd be a strong professional tension there, because out of that professional tension will emerge good things. Similar to other state boards, if there's a non-executive chair and a statutory board, those people would absolutely hold the management team to account, but they'd also be there to support, to bring that business acumen to the table. It doesn't necessarily exist in a police organization. Coincidentally, just after we reported out, I returned to America and went to a police chiefs meeting, a international police chiefs meeting. And I had the opportunity to engage with the Police Executive Research Forum, with people from the Policing Foundation, these think tanks, that do a lot of international work, and they thought the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. In fact, Chuck Wexler documented his enthusiasm about our report, and specifically about the notion of having a statutory board. I not only think it's going to be a good idea here, that it will enhance governance and oversight and accountability here in this environment, I think it's one of our recommendations that's most likely to be replicated elsewhere. But having said that, I would like to hear Peter's perspective on this too.
Just before you come in, if I could just clarify a little bit now, because my difficulty isn't necessarily the existence of the board per se. My difficulty is that it has some powers that I think would better belong to the combined policing authority inspectorate body, and I'm concerned that that body doesn't have any real powers, that it has the ability to discuss and shine a light on, but it doesn't have any real powers or any real teeth in relation to the Gardaí. That's more so my issue, and some of those powers have ended up with the board.
I think if we can be honest and say we had we'd spent a lot of time talking about these issues, and your point was one of the crucial points. What is the bite that the authority has? And the difficulty in Ireland is because there's one police force, there's no competition, with other police forces in effect, and therefore you can't bring in, for instance, another police force to run it if you've got concerns. You can issue critical reports, but ultimately almost the only sanction is to sack the person at the top. And therefore the accountability needs to be woven into the organisation at all sorts of different levels. So absolutely, we believe that we've strengthened the role of the PSCOC because it's got a wider responsibility for community safety, which at the end of the day is what policing is about. But then we've injected some really credible business and people with other reputations and other expertise at that crucial level of governance, of actually running the organisation. Because we felt there's a fundamental tension between a body which has responsibility for oversight and for governance. Because if you're involved with the organisation in governance, it's very hard for you then to operate oversight as to how they're doing in governance. So that was the rush, but it's still the situation is absolutely what you say is exactly what is the sanction. You can issue critical reports. We did debate about whether you hold back some of the budget, but if you do that, you damage the policing. You know, but that is part of the difficulty, and therefore it's really important that this is seen amongst a whole series of other measures which makes An Garda Síochána more transparent, right from the local level, right down to individual officers with body cameras, right the way through at every stage, in terms of improving governance by bringing some independent people into the actual running of the organisation. So it's not just the police profession that's doing that, and then absolutely given that stronger role still for the authority, or you know, to actually still be able to call to account the board and other agencies as well as An Garda Síochána for its performance. But it was a real tension that we discussed on occasion.
And I think Deputy O'Leary's point is absolutely valid. But one of the things that you have to consider when we were considering this, that the level of change that we envisage being implemented is extraordinarily large. Like, it's a very ambitious programme of change. And that cannot be entirely generated or, you know, driven externally. There has to be some stage at which the organisation itself takes responsibility for its own reform and takes that responsibility seriously. So that cannot be entirely externally driven. However, oversight must be entirely external and must be independent. So if there's a new body called PCSOC, which is less focused on governance, it can be more focused actually on its main business, which is oversight and holding An Garda Síochána to account. And one of the things that we had to consider in looking at both the authority, the inspectorate and GSOC, that they all emerged in kind of crisis situations. They were all reactive. You know, there were reactive developments to particular crises. But we had the benefit of being asked to sit back and look at all the oversight bodies in a slightly more deliberative context, the context in which we worked, and ask the question, well, if we were trying to establish an oversight framework, what would it look like? And, you know, one of the key decisions was to say, well, you merge the inspectorate with the authority, and that you create this, what we would like to see as a more, you know, a kind of a deliberative loop that's perhaps less adversarial. Yes, there will still be the possibility of holding feet to fire. GSOC will be the new independent office of police ombudsman. It will have significantly enhanced powers and ought to be resourced. And there's no dodging that issue. But there's also a need to create within the various processes of accountability, bearing in mind that it can happen at all sorts of levels, the strong democratic accountability to this committee, meeting you 4 times a year, and then the more formal professional oversight arrangements between PCSOC and the statutory board. And the idea that a statutory board would ignore something that was said by the Policing and Community Safety Oversight Commission, you know, if that were to occur, that board would not be dysfunctional. A properly constituted board that is legislated for properly would have to take account of what the Policing and Community Oversight Commission said. And in that kind of structured deliberative loop, you would imagine that that would occur. And if that is what, you know, our members who spoke about a culture that hasn't demonstrated sufficient maturation in relation to external accountability, what I would suggest that what we are actually proposing is not postponing that maturation, but actually enabling that maturation right now, and saying, like, if we're going to get to a stage where we can have that mature culture that is comfortable with external oversight and that does robust internal governance, that you have to provide for that. You can't imagine that it will never occur and never make provision for that to occur. What we are saying is this is how you bring it about, and don't postpone it.
Well, I won't dwell on this because I'm sure other people have similar concerns that they may raise, but like, I mean, the board, as I say, per se is not my issue in the internal governance side of things, but I am concerned slightly, perhaps only slightly, that, you know, we have a lot of paper tigers in terms of oversight right across. I'm not just talking about policing in Ireland, and you know, I'd be anxious that PCSOC doesn't become that, and I just think we need to look at that carefully in the legislation as it comes through. I have 2 just maybe briefer ones there, if we can respond to them as briefly as possible. Firstly, in relation to the Code of Ethics and recommendation 42, is it envisioned that Gardaí could be a breach of the Code of Ethics, could be a disciplinary matter? And I suppose just as well, there was concern at the outset from yourselves in relation to the appointment of Garda Commissioner in advance of the report being published. I think you were, if I'm understanding it right, somewhat reassured that it would be okay, and then the policing authority proceeded with the Garda Commissioner. Was there substantial communication of, I don't know, draft recommendations or the general shape of what was discussed with the policing authority, or how was that, I suppose, that reassurance given to you? How we satisfied that it would be okay to proceed with the appointment in advance of publication?
Actually, Deputy, may I?
Please.
Actually, Deputy, the appointment process and everything was not within our scope or remit. You know, we had suggested early on that we'd like to see the appointment of the Garda Commissioner align nicely with the release of our recommendations, because we thought that timing was important, and there was speculation early on that the Garda Commissioner's appointment would happen much earlier, so we thought it would be particularly awkward, but as it turned out, the timing was much better than any of us anticipated. The Commissioner's appointment preceding our publication by only a few weeks. So, and we engaged on a very regular basis with the policing authority, particularly the Secretariat, and also the authority came in and met with us and presented their submission. So there were good, strong lines of communication. I'm sorry. Oh, the Code of Ethics, absolutely. That's a simple answer. That absolutely violation of the Code of Ethics could definitely be considered a disciplinary matter.
Okay, very well. And in relation to recommendation 7, which is an interesting proposal, it's the proposal in relation to the Strategic Threat Assessment Coordinator and that whole office. I suppose, it's something that I think needs a lot of fleshing out. I think you may have deliberately left it open to interpretation for government and opposition, I presume, too. But, I'm going to ask you a number of questions, and if you feel you can answer them, do. If you feel you can't, or if you feel that it's open to interpretation, that's fine too. I suppose, firstly, would it have a statutory basis? Would it have an entitlement to intelligence rather than simply relying upon cooperation? Would it be entitled to oblige? Would the Garda Commissioner and the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces, would they be answerable to this coordinator? Would they be in a position to set priorities? Sorry, I know that they're in a position to set priorities. Would priorities that could be set by this person, would they be requirements on the Defence Forces and the Gardaí, or simply recommendations? And would it be responsible for coordinating investigations such as, for example, data breaches or anything like that?
I would say first that yes, we envisage that this it would be developed on a statutory basis. We see the role as not being an operational role. This National Security Coordinator would not task the Garda Commissioner or task the Chief of Staff. They would not answer to this particular individual. We see that the STAC and this National Security Coordinator as being a resource to the National Security Committee and a research to Cabinet Committee F. And we would think that this group would synthesize intelligence and potentially identify gaps, and when identifying gaps, then notify the National Security Committee, and then the National Security Committee would take the appropriate action. So no, we don't see the National Security Coordinator as being someone who will oversee, or that the Garda Commissioner or the Chief of Staff would answer to, and neither do we see the Strategic Threat Analysis Center playing an operational role in the gathering of intelligence. Would you like to add? Peter actually chairs that.
I don't think we left it vague. I think we have left scope for it to be developed in line with the nature of the threat. I think the thing that struck us was that the nature of the threat that all countries are facing is developing very fast, and therefore the capability of the infrastructure in Ireland will need to develop alongside that. But exactly as Cathy said, we see it essentially as a role. It is a coordinator, but it's an outfit which has got that ability to look much more broadly at what is the nature of the threat, to call in, other sources of intelligence and information, to build strong links with academia and with the business community, who hold, obviously, some of the organisations under threat, and also hold a lot of information at the moment, and also can develop a different culture, and crucially can also gather in new skills. Which are needed, given that a lot of the threat is now carried on the digital infrastructure. But I think we also saw absolutely that and this was really, the recommendations in here were very much driven by the people who came in front of us, who were already engaged in the national security of Ireland, and who felt that absolutely needed greater coordination and recognised that the nature of the threat was changing very rapidly.
Okay.
Can you
a bit clear.
move it on?
Okay.
A bit just in deference to the rest of the colleagues,
okay,
please.
I suppose two very brief final questions there. In my own submission, in our submission, I proposed the idea of a broader criminal justice inspectorate, taking a broader view than just policing, because, look, there are issues, like in relation to the case of Shannon Farrell, if you're familiar with it, there are criticisms made of how the DPP handled that, for example. Other bodies could also come into that, the court service, how that functions, the Irish Youth Justice Service. Now, perhaps you felt that was outside your remit, but did you give any consideration to whether there could be an accountability mechanism of a criminal justice inspector, taking in all bodies that are responsible for criminal justice?
I think the nature of policing, and I'm sure Cathy will agree, and what we saw in the evidence is essentially the way policing is focusing is much, while it will always have a focus around criminal investigation and prosecution, actually the main focus is moving more, looking at wider issues about vulnerable people, recognising that a lot of crime and a lot of criminal careers comes from earlier stages of disadvantage. And therefore, if anything, the degree of coordination now required is with other agencies at the local level, and that again is why we recommended the increased role for the PCC-SOC, because we felt that was the crucial part. I think what we saw in criminal justice, the crucial series of recommendations were about that the prosecution role should be removed from An Garda Síochána for a whole series of reasons, not only because of officer time, but crucially in a democracy, the two roles should be separated, and there should be a national, independent prosecution service. Now, clearly, it wasn't particularly something we looked at in terms of whether there should be a spectre on that side, but they were really the two key dynamics that we pulled up. You're absolutely right to say that there's actually very few incidents which are about the police alone, and which the police alone can solve, and therefore absolutely that ability to pull together other agencies, but those agencies to work together both at the local and the national level are crucial, and why we recommended this wider role for PC-SOC, because of that issue about wider community safety and the protection of vulnerable people.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy O'Leary. Deputy Jim O'Callahan, please.
Chairman, thanks very much all of you for coming in, and thank you for the work you did as commissioners and for producing such a well-written and succinct report. And in fairness, thank you for coming in as well, because people who write reports, they'd be perfectly entitled to say, listen, we were asked to prepare a report, there's our report, and read it. And you don't have to be probed in respect to it. So it's helpful for us to be able to ask you questions in respect of it. I agree with most of the things, the recommendations in the report. They mirror a lot of what was in the submission put in by Fianna Fáil. So, like Donnchadh, I'm not going to concentrate on the good parts or the parts where there's no dispute, and I strongly favour what you've recommended. And I hope you don't think by doing that I'm being negative about it. I'm not, but I just wanted to probe the other areas where there are, I suppose, issues of uncertainty or dispute. In your 9th principle, you talk about the oversight bodies, and you say that a blame culture has infected the relationships between them. Now, can I just ask you to elaborate, in what way is there a blame culture between, say, GSOC and the Guards, and, say, the policing authority and the Guards and the inspectorate at the Guards at present, do you think?
I think at the time, when we first started our work, it was, a very, we were working in the midst of a very tense environment And when we talk, it seemed that there was frustration all around, you know, whether we talked to people in the oversight bodies or whether we talked to people in the police. It just seemed that there was a lot of frustration, and that, and we felt that, you know, we can all accomplish so much more if we work collaboratively. Now, that's not to say, I mean, I worked as the chief inspector of the Garda Síochána Inspectorate and felt very strongly that we needed to engage with people, and we needed to engage with people constructively, but I also thought there should be a strong professional tension there in order for us to be effective. So, but I think it's a matter of striking the right balance, because again, we just were, everywhere we went, you know, the oversight bodies were frustrated, the police were frustrated, and it seemed that it was, just the environment was counterproductive.
Yeah, okay. Like, I think on a lot of occasion, we'd be aware that the Gardaí did object to and were concerned about, let's take, for example, GSOC. But shouldn't GSOC be in the business of blame?
Oh, absolutely, and perhaps, you know, that could have been better worded, because we weren't suggesting that it was any particular oversight body. We suggested that there was kind of an atmosphere of finger pointing on all sides. You know, the police were finger pointing. It was just an unhealthy atmosphere at the time.
I think there is a distinction there between the relationship between the different bodies, and absolutely whether the purpose of a complaint system is solely about blame or about whether it's learning lessons. And I think the debate around policing in general in a number of jurisdictions is how you move absolutely from just looking for misconduct and blame, and how you move more about a healthy culture which is looking to learn lessons but still absolutely holds people to account around misconduct. But in policing there's often it merges what is poor professional practice with what is deliberate misconduct, and that of itself creates a blame culture where individual officers feel that they're not able to make honest mistakes or admit to honest mistakes, and where they feel the realities of their day-to-day working conditions are not appreciated by the bodies that are holding them to account.
Okay. And under the proposal in the report, there's going to be 2 new oversight bodies. There'll be IOPO, which will take the place of GSOC and will be more efficient in terms of dealing with complaints against members of the Garda Síochána. And then there'll be PCSOC, which will supersede the policing authority and the inspectorate, absorbing most of their functions and taking on new ones. I suppose from the point of view of members of the Oireachtas, we will have a direct role in voting on legislation if it comes before us about the establishment of these new statutory bodies. So can I just ask you, how do you see, like I understand the IOPO, how it will operate, how will PCSOC operate in terms of, look at the policing authority which we've had since 2015, how will it differ from that?
Well, we feel that harnessing the resources of the inspectorate and the authority will make it an even more robust body. And we talked about breaking it down into 3 areas of responsibility. The inspection responsibility, the oversight, the meetings and the public oversight that currently exists. We think that's very important, that there should be public meetings where the police are held to account. And then we also think we'd like to see an enhanced role for PCSOC in developing strong structures and systems for bridging the national strategy on policing with the local district model that we envisage. We think that right now there's a lot of room for improvement at the local level, especially around multidisciplinary approaches, how best to organize that. I know Donica and Helen were both involved in these discussions.
I mean, I think one of the enhancements of the Policing and Community Oversight Commission is that this new body, or if it's called an authority, whatever, will have a much deeper and broader intelligence base, that it will have the knowledge from I think a more defined role in coordinating local policing fora. We actually did quite a lot of engagement with local community groups, both urban and rural, in relation to this. That will actually give them a sense of what the policing priorities are on the ground. And because it will have within its ambit the inspectorate, and we know that the inspectorate has an extraordinarily valuable amount of information and a bank of recommendations and all of that, that will all be integrated into the knowledge base of this organisation, which can then use that not just in its oversight exercises, conducting public meetings with the Commissioner, Senior Garda Management or whatever, but can also use it in kind of benchmarking the standards that it wants to see applied in policing plans, that it wants to see operationalised by reference to international experience as well. So I think there is a huge amount of thought went into this. And even those who disagree with the idea of a board don't disagree with the idea of a policing and community oversight commission or authority or whatever it's called. And one of the benefits we had from going around talking to communities, talking to police, talking to all sorts of other people was that you got this sense of, well, what would an enhanced body look like that is actually genuinely connected to what's going on the ground, not taking necessarily all of its riding instructions from every group, because we understand that it has to be coordinated, but that there is this kind of additional value to be got from knowing about what's actually happening in communities and taking that seriously. And it's a clear strand in the 3 pillars of that organisation. It's a very clear strand. It's not tokenistic. It's not a gesture, and it knits completely with the idea that the core of policing is community policing.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Like in terms of, I suppose, the policing authority, I think the experience of members of this committee, like we would be critical of the policing authority, but we liked when we see the policing authority holding a commissioner, senior members of An Garda Síochána to account publicly at meetings, like with a wide experience of it here in terms of homicide figures and other issues. Like obviously it needs to improve, but I suppose a concern that some members have is that are we going to do away with that? But from what you're saying, Donncha, no, that you see that PCSOC will include the functions being carried out by the policing authority and will have enhanced roles as well.
Yeah.
And it will merge with it will take in the inspectorate's functions too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, I think there's actually a misunderstanding about that. Like the idea that there will no longer be a public hearing in Dublin Castle is absolutely wrong. That will continue, and our argument would be that the body that will be doing it will be better equipped to actually do it, better informed than is possible under the current arrangement, whereby you have this disparate set of arrangements between various oversight bodies. So I think that it's critically important for that to be understood out there, that the idea of public accountability, public oversight will continue, absolutely will continue, and as one of the things that the Policing and Community Oversight Commission will do.
Now, you mentioned in the report that the PSOC should have an odd number of people, not exceeding 11. Like, presumably these are people who are going to come from outside the Garda profession. But in terms of the operation of it, like, are you proposing that there will be an office there, similar to the same way as the policing authority has staff, and that it will appraise situations thoroughly? Okay. Then, looking at the next, I suppose, the new part is the Garda board. Like, what's going to be the interaction? Do you view the Garda board as being like a state company where you have a board with a chairman who will operate the chief executive?
Yes. And it was interesting that when we were in the midst of this debate, the recommendation was made to reconstitute the HSE board. So, but we do see it as a statutory board with a non-executive chair.
It came back to that when we looked at other organisations, it almost, why have we not thought about this in policing before? In some ways it seemed fairly obvious when you look at how commercial organisations operate, that you bring in people with other expertise to assist the people, and exactly as Cathy says, police leaders tend to be very good at policing, and you want them to be good at policing.
Yeah.
But now organisations are very complex, and bringing in that additional expertise, it actually strengthens governance and strengthens, the professionalism and accountability of the organisation.
I suppose people would think there's a difference between a state board and An Garda Síochána, just answering you, Peter, there, as to why it shouldn't be treated the same. I understand the logic of what you're stating, but I suppose with a police force, it's not the same as like a company
Well,
like
I think Kathy and I that have been in, we'd say absolutely it is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is, because it's a big complex organisation which in the modern world has got to run an IT department and has got to have HR practices which are in line with what is normal in the rest of society. And it's often that bit which can almost distract police leaders from concentrating on what is the core business, which is policing.
So you see it's like the board will assist the executives who are running
Absolutely.
the police force on management issues, giving them
Absolutely.
external advice. Like what issues? I know it's difficult to be specific about it, but like let's look at the breath test issue. What role would this board have played in respect of that? Are you saying that the issue would have come before the board would have known that we would deal with this?
I would hope that board would be looking at the broader issue about what is the culture of the organisation and how do modern business and other organisations shape culture and put in all the practices that make sure that sort of thing wouldn't happen, because it would again have a very strong risk management process that would absolutely say here is a risk area. So obviously at times it might have to react that something has gone wrong, but the main focus would absolutely be how in a modern complex organisation do you put in processes to identify risk and to manage risk, and how do you inject professionalism into every level. And the trouble is, sometimes police leadership misses those sorts of things because it is very reactive and it's reacting to the latest crisis. I think the other benefit of the board, it was enabled the organisation to look a bit more long term rather than just reacting to what is the latest policing operation or the latest thing that's gone on.
But I suppose if you look at an example like a statutory or semi-state body, it doesn't have an oversight body, statutory body, reviewing it in the same way as the Gardaí are going to have PCSOC. Now, I know the oversight body is distinct from the management role to be played by the board, but doesn't that distinguish it from other state entities, that on one level you've got an oversight body that is checking it and is probing it and is kicking the tires and making sure, for instance, like the breath test issue, that should have been revealed earlier? Whereas
I would argue again that because policing has particular powers over the rights of the citizen in a very profound way, particularly when you've got a national police force, that absolutely says why you need a stronger oversight body. But again, as we've discussed, because of the relationship with other agencies and the wider drive for community safety, that absolutely justifies this role.
Yeah.
So it's
in fairness to you, you're not correlating oversight with management.
No,
your board is going to be involved in management.
And they are
PSOC is going to be involved in oversight.
And also, I should mention, Deputy, that we see the board and the commissioner being subject to the oversight of PCSOC.
Can I apologise to the committee? I thought we were officials over
No problem, information. We'd like to thank Peter very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter.
He had to leave at this time, and again, our thanks to you.
Thank you.
We've met you all in private session during the course of your own deliberations, and it's great to have had you all back this evening. Thank you very much indeed. So, Jim, please.
Keep quiet permanently. Can I just say then, is it correct that you don't view the Garda board as being part of the oversight and accountability architecture, or do you view it as being part of that?
Well, I view it as being part of the accountability architecture, but not part of the oversight architecture. I mean, PCSOC and GSOC would be the newly named organization, would be the two oversight bodies.
Just to be clear as well, you're absolutely right. Policing is exceptional. It's not the same as any other state entity or whatever. But that doesn't mean that because of that exceptionalism, that the police shouldn't have a board. It has a board that does a particular purpose. And as Peter has pointed out, the careful oversight architecture that has been, in a sense, reconstituted by our recommendations addresses that exceptionalism. But when we thought carefully about this, why would you not have a board for An Garda Síochána? You wouldn't have it just because you say it's like any other state body. That's not the reason we say that there should be a board. It's in fact to try and bring clarity to the governance and oversight arrangements. Accountability happens at all sorts of levels, including the political and democratic level in this forum. as well as in a board and in a manner of speaking in the oversight mechanisms.
Okay, so thanks very much for those answers.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan. Deputy Mick Wallace, please. Sorry, Deputy Brophy.
Commission Deputy Wallace, Deputy, could I ask, because I haven't on a time thing, as I had already discussed with
By all means, if Deputy Wallace is happy with that.
If you,
yes.
I'll just limit it to one, because some of the areas have already been covered. It's really just to take up where we left off there, but the one thing is, because you can't divorce the reality of what then happens in the real world, of the accountability of the Minister in the Department of Justice, which is the one area that we haven't actually touched on in relation to this. So you have your oversight provision, which you've talked about there, you have your board effectively interacting with the Commissioner. Where does that structure, are we at risk, which is what my worry is in listening to this, of almost layering up on top of that? Because in reality, there will be a direct accountability back to the Minister. And that's where I would agree with what Deputy O'Callaghan said or something. I mean, I know that there's a tendency to say, well, it's like a semi-state or it's like a commercial organisation. It's not, and it never will be. And in terms of accountability, we have to accept that. You know, this area, in a different way, in a completely different way, you had that old type of scenario, which maybe I don't expect you to be totally familiar with, but there was an RTÉ authority which had a view of broadcasting and a control thing. When we were looking at the modernisation of that, we created a broadcasting authority which took some of that, but still it comes back to a minister. So where, can you just ask, can you answer me, does that fit in terms of what you're proposing?
Thank you, Deputy. I think that's very clear. I mean, ultimately, in this democracy, at the end of the day, all of these different components should answer to the Minister and the Oireachtas, the democratically elected members, representatives of the people. So not only will the Garda Commissioner and the board be accountable to the Minister, but so will PCSOC, so will the new oversight, the new body that will replace GSOC. They're all essentially accountable to the Minister and to the Oireachtas.
Oh, okay, so my point out of that then is, and I'm trying to just tease this out. I mean, it sounds like the board on one level has no teeth. It's almost putting together a board of directors to advise the management on the day-to-day structure. Or where does the teeth come into the board?
A significant function in relation to budgets, in relation to policing plans. So it actually does have significant powers, and insofar as it impacts on what you might call the minister/stroke departmental level. Well, I mean, one of the aspirations behind creating this structure is that if we believe, as we clearly do, that the involvement of the Department of Justice in the micromanagement of policing crises or policing generally is not a good idea, well then you have to, in considering that, take steps to ensure that that's less likely to occur. So by creating that, a board arrangement, the Commissioner has an entity to engage with that can assist in the kind of issues on which she or he needs assistance. And the department, which rightly should be focused on the creation of criminal justice policy, policing policy, wider policy in relation to public safety, and indeed with other government departments, can focus properly on that business. Now, that might seem high-minded or a little bit too aspirational, but that is in fact one of the issues, not the primary issue, but one of the issues that influenced our thinking in relation to this, that as a matter of fact, the Department of Justice and Equality exists, the Minister for Justice and Equality will always exist. That's a legitimate thing. We're not against that, but we need to ensure that there is a superstructure within which policing occurs where that doesn't dominate to the extent that it possibly has, or doesn't create problems that oughtn't to be created, or that it doesn't need, problems that it doesn't need itself.
Okay, thank you. And can I just obviously thank you for all your work and your report and everything else. Thank you very much. And apologies again for having to leave.
Not at all. Thank you, Deputy Brophy. Deputy Mick Wallace. Thanks,
Caoimhghín, and thank you very much for coming and for your report. And you don't work for any. We have a lot of state bodies and organisations coming in here, and we obviously have a responsibility to seriously hold them to account. Well, we're not looking to hold you to account. As far as we're concerned, you're just about gone, and you were never. You came, you've done your report, and you're finished, and you're not working for the state. But listen, obviously, I want to. The majority of what's in the report, likewise, as the others have said. Of course, we agree with most of what's in the report. We did read the Garda Inspectorate reports of 2014 and 15, and we would identify a lot of what you're saying in those reports. Obviously, we do have a disagreement on the issue of the GSOC, Police and Authority, the Inspectorate position. We do feel that there have been a little bit, you say you're amalgamating them, you're just changing the name of GSOC. I'm not so sure why there's a need to change the name of it. You use the argument about making it sound more independent from the Garda Síochána themselves. And you're kind of amalgamating the other two. But really, it does look like a bit of a watering down of what they were doing. And we wouldn't be the only ones that would feel that. For example, Dermot Walsh, who you'll be familiar with, probably one of the most serious commentators on policing that we have in Ireland at an academic level. He's a professor of law at Kent University. And just a quote from him, he just said, "Despite the recent establishment of the Police and Authority, the Garda has remained largely insulated from effective democratic scrutiny and transparency. The Commission's recommendations for change have the merit of bringing much-needed clarity and cohesion to the complex and confusing infrastructure to this vital area. At the same time, however, they seem to entail a significant strengthening of the power and status of the Garda Commissioner and the relationship between the Government and senior Garda management. The latter, of course, was one of the key concerns that led to the establishment of the Commission in the first place." Now, we probably feel that, and this is not a criticism, but we feel that we have kind of a practical take on what's happening with how policing happens in Ireland, and we also obviously have a take on where we think it's going. We've been involved, myself and Deputy Daly, since 2011-12 in dealing with a lot of the stuff that was going on, and we were raising Garda issues when it was dangerous in this place, and we were nearly run out of the place for it, right? And things have changed since then. But forgive us for thinking that your take on it is a bit, I suppose, more theoretical, maybe, for want of a better word. You talk about, for example, the frustration of talking with the fact that you found when talking to GSOC, inspectors, police and authority, and we understand that they were frustrated, because you know what, as we argued, and we introduced a bill in 2013 and 14 to try and address the challenges that were there and to change things. Now, the government have refused to actually bring in what we recommended. They brought in bits and pieces of it, right? But the problem, they're frustrated because they were never given the powers that they should have been given. I mean, the Garda Inspectorate, for example, there's over a number of years, they brought in over 500 recommendations, right? And it was mad to think that after 2013, for example, just to give you an example with the inspectors, I just write it out today. The inspector had no statutory responsibility for the monitoring of the implementation of recommendations made in its reports, something which I'm not so sure it is have dealt with. However, the inspector established a process with Garda Síochána in 2008, which resulted in the publication, this is without government help, in the publication of status implementations update reports twice a year on the inspectorate's website. But the last such regular update was published in November 13. Right? When Noreen came in, Noreen abandoned it, right? So they hadn't a clue whether any of the recommendations they were making were being implemented after that. They were just being left in the dark. So you can understand why they were frustrated. GSOC were a bit frustrated because the guards had the potential to absolutely ignore what they wanted. They wouldn't give them information if they didn't feel like it. They'd give it to them late if they felt like it. The government wouldn't give them the legislative powers to go and get what information they wanted. And they wouldn't give them the money to do the job properly. They couldn't even hire the people they needed to actually do the job properly. And the Policing Authority, and we would think, we were critical of the Policing Authority too, but mainly because we felt the government should have given them more power. And, like for example, they weren't allowed to hold the Commissioner to account. And with year arrangement, I would still think, we'd feel that one of the problems that we had, the reason that Minister Shatter lost his job and Francis is after him, right, and that the Commissioners lost theirs, was because they were too close. Now, you say that the board might be a buffer between them, but I'm not so sure that that's going to work that way. And you're saying that accountability for the Commissioner will still go back to the Minister for Justice and the Justice Committee and the Oireachtas, right? Well, listen, we actually wouldn't be mad about, okay, we actually think that this Justice Committee is not the worst it's ever been, but it's the first time the opposition dominated. Normally, it'll be government dominated, and I'd say they'll never make the mistake again of allowing the opposition to dominate it. It was a serious overlooking on their part, right? But so, yeah, it was mad stuff, isn't it? But well, anyway, it's unlikely to be. So really what you had was, and what we're likely to have again, is the Commissioner and the Minister for Justice almost one entity. And one of them can hardly say boo without the other approving. And that's where Minister Shatter's problems came from. And sadly, Francis had problems in the same area. Look, there's so many. There's so many things I want to say. I can't keep you here all night. So maybe. Yeah, I have. Yeah, I mean, two of your own members, Vicky Conway and Eddie Malloy, would probably have had something of the same concerns that we have in this area. Why do you think that they refused to agree with your arrangement around the area of oversight in contrast to your position on it?
Well, I'm pleased you mentioned that because, as you know, Deputy, we have approximately 50 recommendations in our report, and there's only one where we, at the end of the day, had any disagreement. And I think that's absolutely remarkable, given the fact that we're 11 people who sat around a table for a year and a half who represent very, very different perspectives. And the only two of us who had any direct policing experience were myself and Peter Fahy. I mean, it was similar to my experience in Northern Ireland and Patton, where only two of us had any policing experience. But I think that's a wonderful thing at the end of the day, because we had academics, we had business leaders, we had people committed to human rights, people committed to victims' rights, and we all came together representing very different perspectives. And I think, you know, I'm looking at the glasses being 98% full, because in 49 recommendations, we came to complete consensus. And in this one instance, we don't necessarily disagree on everything, because we all agreed that we should amalgamate include the inspectorate into the authority, and we agree that the powers of the authority should be expanded. Right. So, you know, so this is very small disagreement in the overall context of things. We felt that it was really important, because we worked very in mutual respect. I mean, this was an extraordinary team of people, and we really, you know. We have great mutual respect for one another, and we thought that in the spirit of transparency and mutual respect, we should include that footnote noting the dissenting opinion of two of our members. 9 of us felt very strongly that this was the right recommendation. And I would say that I was chuckling a bit when you were saying it was a bit theoretical, because I really based a lot of my own perspective on this and my 5 to 6 years that I spent as the first chief inspector of the Guard Inspectorate. You know, I stood up that organization and led that organization for 5 to 6 years, right in the aftermath of the 2005 Garda Síochána Act, when the first new bodies were created, GSOC and the Inspectorate at that time. Of course, as you know, the authority wasn't created until more recently. But I experienced my own frustrations as the chief inspector when we worked really hard to develop recommendations, publish publish recommendations. I was the one in 2008 who said we need to create an online tool to show people what's happening when we issue recommendations, to show people, to gauge progress, to show whether these recommendations have been adopted and implemented. So I was the one who actually put that in place. I feel, personally, as one who was in that position, that combining the roles and the resources of the inspectorate and the authority is brilliant, because as the chief inspector, now I can bring those recommendations into a public forum where the authority's holding a public meeting and hold the Garda Commissioner to account as to why or why not certain recommendations have been either implemented or ignored. That wasn't a tool we had available to us in the inspectorate. We published we published recommendations. They were presented to government, and we hoped that they'd actually be implemented. But we didn't have a public forum to hold people to account.
Okay, well, I think we'd agree, right, that, I read the Garda Inspector's submission to you, the 17 pages, and which I thought was very good. Why didn't you decide to actually give the Garda Inspectors the actual tools that they needed to do their job properly, and give them the power of inspection, unannounced inspection, give them the authority to actually follow up on how their recommendations were going, and, as you say, also, and why didn't you give the policing authority those extra powers that were going to make them more effective, rather than amalgamating them?
Well, I think that by harnessing their resources, they can be stronger and more efficient. And by the way, there's nothing in our report that criticizes the work of the policing authority or the work of the inspectorate. Both of those organizations have done important work during their existence. So I want to underscore that. We didn't criticize anything. We actually think we'll make them stronger. We think by harnessing those resources and bringing people together, it'll be a much more powerful oversight organization.
Could I just make 2 points in the context of the legislative process that may ensue to create a policing community oversight commission or authority? It's of course possible to make those proposals and to have that considered in that context. One thing I'd like to just double back a bit on is what you said about GSOC, just for the record. We're certainly not suggesting a cosmetic change there of just changing the name. The reason for changing the name is because a survey of GSOC indicated that the public perceive it to be a Garda organisation and not an independent organisation. So we want to underscore and put beyond doubt its independence. But if you look at our recommendations in relation to its powers and functions, they're greatly enhanced by what we propose. And yes, that does involve significant additional resourcing. We've been really clear on that this cannot be done on the basis of meagre resources. And in fact, if you see what GSOC themselves have proposed and what they have suggested to the department by way of legislative reform, we're substantially ad idem with them on what's needed. So I just would be concerned that there might be a perception that we didn't, suggest quite radical reform of that organisation.
No, and listen, and we actually were recommending the same things as some of the things that you're bringing in as well, so we were completely on the same wavelength as that, right? Come here, just to move on a bit, I know you don't be here all night. You see on recommendation 18, we recommend the urgent introduction of streamlined processes for decision-making and procurement approvals within Garda Síochána. Now, I'm just wondering if you just maybe I got the impression that maybe you hadn't taken just how bad the problems are in this area in Garda Síochána are, and just to give you a small taste of it, Accenture, the IT management company, which really is kind of taken over that area, and but in 2016 alone, Garda Síochána paid them 26.5 million, but it gets a lot worse than that. An audit by the Garda Internal Audit Section into Garda Information and Communications Technology, ICT, payments for 2016 and completed in August 17, which RT's John Burke got from a Freedom of Information request, found serious problems with their contract with Accenture. The aim of the audit was to examine the payments process and whatever, right? But the audit found no assurances that public procurement requirements were being complied with, and this represented a high risk. The Garda contract with Accenture, which was provided to the audit, was dated August 2009. The audit stated that as this contract was not renewed since 2009, it was not satisfied that Garda Síochána complied with the procurement obligations. The audit notes that Accenture staff are the only external IT contractors who do not record their attendance and hours on an electronic clock-on system. Not only are these problems with the contract and the staff, the audit also found that Garda Síochána had been paying Accenture in advance before the work was done. I was surprised that you didn't actually go there, or was that outside your remit, because it's such a problem area for them?
Well, our job was to focus on the future. We certainly followed the stories of the day in the news. I followed some of that media coverage of Accenture and that contract, but we talked about creating the model for the future that will prevent situations such as that from developing in the future. If you have the right management team in place that includes not just police, but people with business acumen who know how to manage businesses internally in the organization, and then you have the board with similar business acumen who can question them to ensure that they have the right risk registers in place, that they're operating and managing the business appropriately. We think that that will address a lot of those issues and prevent weaknesses such as those developing in the future. Helen has a lot of experience in business and has served on state board previously.
And sorry, maybe just one other point I'd add to what Cathy has said on that is, you know, we were aware, I suppose, in our looking at the current environment by way of deciding what was best for the future, we were aware of some of those things, but we were equally aware that there is a need for a very significant step up in the IT infrastructure, particularly to get mobile enabled, which is kind of common in most other police forces at this stage, and that the current process that was being run around those newer technologies was very cumbersome and required a level of specification of the system that, in our view, needed to be looked at differently to enable those to happen in a reasonable time period. And a number of those systems are absolutely crucial to the organisation actually being able to operate more effectively and more efficiently. And that was what that was about. It was particularly about the procurement of IT systems, not IT support, but new systems that are needed.
Yeah, just have two more points and I'll be gone. Just on the issue of the board, right? You say that the Commission has recommended that Garda Síochána should have a statutory board. The purpose of the board is to strengthen the governance and accountability of the organisation. As is routine in good corporate governance, the board would be comprised of external members from the business and professional sectors with expertise in human resources, labour relations, criminal justice, financial management, IT and other areas of management. Did you not consider, I mean, we have boards in Ireland stacked with these people left, right and centre, right? And we've kind of had enough of them. And we wondered why would you have not considered, like for example, people from, why not include someone from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the Ombudsman for Children, Data Protection, and even someone from the travelling community. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist all the time, and people who don't necessarily have all these management skills have a lot to bring to the table, and we feel a lot of that is missing. And you were making the argument that you were kind of thinking that the Gardaí was like a state body, like a commercial organisation, but I actually don't really buy that. Commercial organisations are driven 100% to make a profit, and it's all about making money and making sure it works. That's not what we want from the Gardaí. Yeah, maybe we have a different perception of it, but I have a whole different idea as to what our Garda should be doing and what it should look like. And I find it hard to see us treating it like a commercial organisation is the way forward.
Well, I would totally agree with you, Deputy. I wouldn't want to see it being treated as a commercial organization either. I think the board's interests should be the stakeholders, and the stakeholders in this instance are the people that the Gardaí serve.
And there's also, just in relation to the composition of the Policing and Community Oversight Commission, its board is actually very representative and does have that concern about communities and human rights and their visible presence on that board, bearing in mind that that will be the oversight mechanism, if you look at what we said in relation to the composition of the Commission itself. Right.
Okay, my last point, just a short quote from Conor Brady. He says, this is an article he wrote shortly after the report coming out. He says, the political establishment and civil servants have nothing against An Garda Síochána as a community police force, but their desire for a strong blue line of defence for the state is greater. That imperative, along with the ambition of rolling back external scrutiny, is threaded through this report to a degree that is surprising and disturbing. I just wonder what comments would you make on that?
Well, I have great respect for Conor. He was involved in our commission very early on, and made the decision a personal decision to step away. But we had great respect for him early in the process, and I'm just sorry his voice didn't continue at the table. But again, you mentioned another academic earlier for whom I have great respect. I've actually presented at conferences with him, but haven't had the opportunity to sit with either Conor or sit with the other academic you mentioned to have a discussion about the rationale that eventually led to some of these recommendations. So I look forward to doing that at some point.
Well, Conor is referring to the security element. And obviously that was a big call to make, and listen, we can see the pluses and minuses of it, but there's a lot of people who would think different, and I mean I just kind of wondered as to how ye I know it's obviously what the Gardaí would like, it's what the government would like. It's probably an area that we would have liked to see a more fresh approach to. Did you just consider doing it different, or were you adamant from the word go that you're going to keep security separate and out of sight of any oversight bodies?
Oh no! One of the things we actually recommend is independent overseer of that will examiner that would be responsible for reviewing the arrangements and also the compliance with legislation, security legislation. So we recommend an independent examiner in the security space.
But you wouldn't like to see it coming under the same oversight structure as the Gardaí?
No, because it's not purely a policing function. I mean, we recognise that there are other agencies involved in this, the Defence Forces, the Revenue Commissioners or whatever, and in taking that into account and taking account of the evolving nature of the security threats, some of which we can't possibly even imagine, we suggested a different approach to that, but not by any means confirming any monopoly for An Garda Síochána in relation to policing. We very clearly argued for the creation of a new strategic threat analysis centre in the Department of Taoiseach, not in the Department of Defence or not in the Department of Justice and Equality, and a national security coordinator and all that goes with that. So we would argue, I mean, Peter chaired this group and he's not here, but we would argue that's a very innovative approach that has learnt actually from what has worked and what hasn't worked elsewhere. And we were very clear that there would be oversight of that through the appointment of an independent examiner. Given the different task of overseeing security issues, there are sensitivities that wouldn't apply in relation to regular policing oversight, and their national interests at stake, etc., etc., etc. So there was quite a careful consideration there in relation to what should be done, and what we suggest is actually a very significant change in relation to security arrangements for this state.
Right, okay, but we would probably still feel that the pause of the politicians are probably too strongly wrapped around too many of these things still.
That's perfectly valid view.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Wallace. Okay, and our final contributor, Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for coming in. And I think it is important to say at the start, because it is late in the day, and because of the interference with the Dáil, that your attendance is appreciated, and this is actually an important part of the process in the Dáil's deliberations on what will happen with this report. I'm on the Business Committee, and I know, for example, that there is a desire to have us discuss the report in the Chamber, but the other deputies wanted us to discuss it first in the Justice, and to have, because he couldn't come into the Chamber, that your voice would be heard inside the Houses, the Oireachtas, first on it and aired here, and then the rest of the discussion goes into the House. So it's been really beneficial for that, and it's part of that jigsaw, and I think it's important to say that. I suppose following on from what Mick says, in some ways we maybe look at this a bit differently, because we feel my grey hair comes from our long-standing desire to have Garda reform for a long time. And when we say that there's stuff in it that's not new, what we mean is that this is some stuff in it, and a lot of it is very good stuff. But it's very good stuff that it was identified some time ago. And in that sense, when he said about GSOC, that it's not new, the newly called GSOC is everything that we asked for and everything that GSOC asked for years. And it could have been in place a number of years ago. And actually, it could be in place this year. It was part of this committee's recommendations, actually, a lot of the stuff, if the political will was there. So what's being proposed now, we don't object to it, we welcome that, and everybody does, but it's not new in that sense. And that's, I have to say, when I say that, and I mean there's a whole load of stuff, that doesn't mean, even though it would be my view, that one of the reasons for the establishment of the Commission was a political decision to head off, I suppose, a lot of political dialogue around the clamour for reform. That doesn't mean that we're saying it was a waste of time, or that you didn't do the job you were asked to do, or anything like that. Actually, I think there has been a very good role in engaging in that dialogue around the country, in, as all the buzzwords, having the conversation, and I genuinely do feel that everybody talking about these issues, and in fact bringing them into the report collectively, a lot of the stuff, giving away reducing the task to the coroners, not prosecuting in courts, serving summonses, prison escorts, the Inish stuff, the procurement, all of that good stuff that was out there, very important, bringing in people on the grid. So I think it's important to say that, because obviously a lot of the discussion has centred on the points of disagreement or lack of clarity, so, which is now what I'm going to do. I know, do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying it because imbalancing, the other stuff is good and important in that, right? So that's on that. Now, on the other stuff, I have to say, and maybe it's the lateness of the day, but I'm even more concerned now about this idea of the board, because a couple of reasons as to why we need it, and a couple of the points I jotted down. Well, one of the things was, well, sure, look at now, I mean, the guards come through the ranks. You couldn't be expecting some fella now who kind of, was started off as a guard, sitting in a station, drinking tea and scratching himself or whatever, to rise through the ranks and suddenly be able to run an organisation, that type of thing. I found it actually a little bit maybe derogatory to some of our people who are at the tops of the guards, and like the point was made, well, at a certain point the internal drive has to come internally at a certain point. Do you not think that has begun and is in place internally already? Like, what do you think Drew Harris should be doing now that he hasn't already indicated that he's going to do? I suppose that's my first question. I mean, like, yeah, I mean, is there no guards that you think have been able to run a police force? It seems kind of strange to me that would be put forward as a reason. I mean, it's been put forward as a management thing.
I just clarified that myself. Maybe because I started that conversation, and I apologize, Deputy, if I created that impression. I was referring to I was referring to Peter and myself, okay? And Peter and myself have been very fortunate to have benefited from good educational opportunities earlier in our lives, but we still rose through the ranks of policing, and as we rose through the ranks I was referring to ourselves in that context, not necessarily members of the Garda Síochána, but it's typical, our experience is not dissimilar to police services elsewhere, and I would suggest probably police service in Ireland, that once you focus on your police career, traditionally that focus has been primarily in the area of policing and investigations and security. And as you come up through the ranks, those are the things you learn as part of the police craft. So we really need to supplement that. You know, when I remember being put into a position at once after being a Boston police officer for many years, when suddenly I was responsible for the whole justice portfolio in the state of Massachusetts, and I had responsibility for 20 agencies, over 10,000 employees, you know, over $1 billion operating budget. I needed to surround myself with people who had serious business acumen and experience in areas of finance and HR, and you know, because I wasn't an expert in those particular areas, I was the policing and public safety expert, and as a team we needed to be a cohesive team that included people with a variety of skill sets. So and I have a great respect for the many very smart people in the Garda Síochána. I'm just saying that the entire team has to be a diverse team of people representing very different skill sets. And traditionally in policing, most of us that have risen to chief's positions or commissioner positions have focused primarily on the police craft. That's all. So I hope I would never intend to insult. I was referring to my own personal experience, and Peter has concurred with me on that in the past. So thank you for allowing me to clarify.
No, well, I mean, in fairness, it is sort of implied in the report as well that, like, you know, the expertise wouldn't be there internally with somebody who came up through the ranks. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, so we would all agree that, you know, should the organisation be run better or run well or managed properly? No one's going to be opposed to that. But that's a bit of a red herring in terms of this discussion in some ways. I mean, they have a director of HR, they have a finance operator and so on and so on. That's, you know, who's getting up to speed on computers. They never had a director of IT before in the Guards because there was no computers years ago. You know, society evolves, they need to manage. But that's a kind of, it's nothing got to do with, if you like, oversight and accountability. And yet, the text of the document is proposing that the Guards really are firstly accountable to this board. They are the people who deal with appointments, and I suppose my concern is that this is resulting in more control internally now, because it's an internal board, which is, you know, making the appointments and making the decisions, and in essence that's where the clout is, I suppose, you know.
I think that adjective internal needs to be.
I addressed this earlier when I said about you know, taking ownership of a change agenda that is as ambitious as it is. It cannot be entirely externally driven, and you know, this is, given the scale of the organisation, given what has to be done, given the political context it exists in and that it should exist in, it can't avoid that. That's a democratic reality. That you have to augment whatever is there. And all of the people who exist at the senior management level, HR, whatever, they're all members of Garda Síochána, whether civilian or sworn or whatever. But this board isn't. The board would be non-members of Garda Síochána with a non-executive independent chair. And like, it's not that they're going to be sitting there as a board making these appointments day in, day out. You know, they would use the facilities that exist for making appointments through the Public Appointment Service or some other independent mechanism, and then deal with those recommendations. You know, there's nothing to say, for example, that if you were constituting a board to make particular appointments, that somebody from PCSOC couldn't be on the board. I mean, that's the way these things happen all of the time. They would simply approve them in that setting. And again, it's, you know, that there's nothing to suggest that a board wouldn't adopt very transparent processes. If you look at the way some state boards operate, you can read their minutes and they can be detailed or whatever online. So I think we need to be careful not to caricature what is being proposed here. It is actually a serious attempt to address the complex issues, and it's offered in that particular way. It's also linked to the suggestion that the Commissioner is the CEO, that the Commissioner should be empowered as a CEO, but that also means that if you empower a Commissioner to act as a CEO, that the CEO has to be accountable properly and has to be responsible for the exercise of their powers, but they also have to be resourced. So we're not saying that somebody who comes up through the ranks won't have all of the abilities to be the Commissioner. Clearly, she or he will have those abilities, but you have to augment those with this level of assistance, which isn't the assistance that you get from your management team, which is part of your team. That's truly internal. This is at an arm's length from what is actually going on internally, and is that proper proximity, but the proper distance as well from the operational detail of policing.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, I've no desire to caricature this, but I actually don't understand it, and I actually think I understand it less now, because to me it smacks as a sort of a halfway house. Because on the one hand, you've spent a lot of time kind of dealing with that it is internal, it's management, it's governance, it's all that good stuff, which, as you correctly say, there are the people I refer to, the directors of HR or whatever, that's their day-to-day bread and butter. So you have this other crowd here who don't do that day-to-day, but who sit back and say, well, actually, do you know what, like, I'm here, like, I'm the HR director of whatever, some big multinational, and you could be doing this different, or we'll have an input here on that. But the problem is that this has been used as a justification to take powers away from the external oversight body. Because what we have is that we have this new PSOC, or whatever they're called, which we've said is the amalgamation of the policing authority and the Garda Inspectorate, but with a lot of the functions that the policing authority had not transferring. And this internal board getting a lot of powers, particularly the power of appointments. And you know, the expertise that you talk about, for example, do you not think that exists on the policing authority in Northern Ireland, for example? That they have that broader expertise that you're talking about transferring to the board, and they have an influence over appointments, and that they've got actually a better balance there than what we're proposing to do now. Because maybe you could build this in, because we have to see it in the context of where we've come from. And I would like you to maybe make a point of the observations, whether you have had a chance, maybe you haven't, and if you haven't, it's not your fault, and I'm not blaming you, to read the Charlton report. But Justice Charlton was actually, his conclusions were very illuminating. And this is an individual who's involved from the time of the Morris Tribunal, and he talked about culture and the need to change culture, and said the mistakes that we've made is setting up structures and responding in structures. But to me, that's kind of what you've done here. I'm not saying in terms of the controversial bits, I'm not saying there isn't a lot of other good stuff that will help. But why do you think the culture is as bad as it is? I think, and you can disagree with me, is that one of the reasons was that the appointments were made internally. It related to who was pally with the commissioner, who came up through the ranks, and that people were getting appointed to senior level, not on the basis of merit, but rather who they knew. This was done internally, and there was too much of a political influence between the Department of Justice and the commissioner. And what we seem to be doing now is having moved a bit of the way to give the police and authority that job of oversight to begin the job. And that's all we gave them. We didn't give them the full package, because a lot of appointments then were kind of made before they were set up. We didn't give them the chance to deal with the commissioner, but the basic structure was there. And instead of taking that to its logical conclusion, to develop a real policing authority with teeth and the expertise you're talking about and accountability over the commissioner, we've gone from taking it back off them and internally giving the Garda Commissioner more power, getting back that power, and the Department of Justice back. And I wonder, would you maybe, you know, in fairness, the Toland report made the point that the Department of Justice has never used the powers that it had to hold the Gardaí to account. So I'm wondering why you chose to go that way. And maybe one, I mean, I know I'm throwing quite a few things, but I mean, you keep saying that the new authority, like the PSOC or whatever it is, has greater powers of oversight. What are they? Because I can't see any.
The Effectiveness and Renewal Group that exists on foot of Toland actually agrees with us in relation to this matter, and they agree with us.
Which matter do they agree with you?
In relation to the creation of a statutory board, they agree unequivocally with us in their second progress report, published a week or two ago, I think, and. So, you know, and that derives directly from Toland. Cathy O'Toole was a member of the Toland review group. I mean, again, there's a lot in what you say, and just to kind of to try and unpack some of it, our starting position is that governance and oversight ought not to be located in the one entity, and that is what informs our view that you locate oversight properly and effectively in PCSOC, and as one of the governance functions is the making or approving of appointments, which again can be done at one remove from a board and done properly in accordance with normal public sector practice, that is you know, I don't think that was the most important thing that the authority did. I think the most important thing that the authority did since its foundation was, in fact, to implement its oversight function in relation to policing externally. And therefore, in that context, that is the rationale for what we propose. Insofar as it looks to you like as if we're saying, well, you're transferring a lot of power back to the Commissioner. One of the difficulties in holding a Commissioner to account if they don't have power is how can a Commissioner be accountable for something for which they don't actually have power? If we're saying to a Commissioner, you now have to lead an organisation in respect of which there is a huge change agenda and it's really ambitious, they have to be empowered to do that, resourced to do that in whatever way, but equally held accountable. And if we are saying, well, you don't want this cosy relationship with the Department of Justice or one that is too involved, the board actually creates an accountability mechanism that is independent of that and that does create, in fact, we would hope, a functioning accountability platform for the Commissioner in that sense, so that she or he is actually accounting for what they do, but they're also empowered to do it. And you know, to date, that has been something of a difficulty. That is, as I see it, our rationale for this proposal.
But the Commissioner has been empowered to appoint his own management now, when that was a job for the Policing Authority.
Yeah,
and like, who's appointing the board? Is he selecting the board, or is the government selecting the board?
No. I mean, if you consider the task of any person who is the chief executive officer of an organisation, you know, it is vitally important that that person can actually have some say in the selection of their team. Like, in other words, that they can appoint people that they can work with and work effectively with, and obviously all of those people work subject to their own accountability mechanisms. They have to be able to do their jobs, etc., etc. And so it's not, you know, if your view is that everything can be driven externally by a body that is doing oversight, regulating the police, if you will, and running the police, well, we just respectfully disagree with that view. We're kind of saying the police actually have to, through their own entity, run An Garda Síochána and be accountable and have oversight. That's, you know, I think the coherence of our view.
So you think the Northern Ireland Policing Authority?
We haven't commented on arrangements in other jurisdictions. We've looked at arrangements in other jurisdictions, but we haven't. You know, we haven't.
So you feel there was a problem with the appointments made?
No, we're looking at the future of policing in this jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And what we genuinely believe works in this jurisdiction.
No, and I'm trying to understand, but given that we've started a new process and the Policing Authority were involved in senior appointments and so on, are you saying there was a problem with those appointments, that it led to a difficulty? That, because it seems bizarre to me that, you know, appointments would be made that the Garda Commissioner couldn't live with or anything like that. It's more about the point I'm trying to get to is that what would be out there is that the Commissioner being accountable to the board rather than the Minister is actually more democratic.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're certainly not criticising any appointments that were made. I mean, what we're saying is standing back from the different contexts in which each of those oversight bodies was, you know, brought into existence and looking at it afresh. What would you do to make them more effective? And in that context, and taking the view that oversight and governance are separate and ought to be separate functions, that is the rationale for our thinking. Not, you know, if that implies, you know, criticism, it doesn't. It actually, what it implies is that things could in fact be done better and more effectively, and it's not in any sense a comment on any appointment made by the authority.
I suppose the point is that there will be a view that there is a difference between oversight and holding people to account. Like, you can say, have a public meeting and say, now that's desperate, lads, you're after making a holy show of yourselves there. And lads go, yeah, all right, we're going to go back and do whatever we like. You go on, you can give us a bit of lip, but, you know, we're going to do what we like because you say it's going to make any difference. If
there's a properly functioning board, and if PCSOC has issued a report based on a public hearing with the Commissioner that's critical If that board is doing its job, it's going to say to the Commissioner, what are you proposing to do in response to what PCSOC said? Because at the next PCSOC hearing, they will be saying, what have you done and what has your board told you to do, or how has your board responded? So, I mean, I actually think that it's not at all the case that this will in some sense diminish the level of effectiveness. In fact, our view is that it will enhance.
But is it not the same point that if you had a proper functioning Garda executive and the oversight body made the points that they would respond anyway?
Sorry, I don't understand what you mean by
if you had a properly functioning, I suppose, Garda executive or hierarchy or whatever, answerable, say, to a policing authority.
Yeah.
Like, is it not the same point?
Well,
like,
have we had that?
Have we had that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the question
in the experience of the authority to date.
Well, you see, I think this is the point, like, is that it was been well flagged before the establishment of the authority that they were not, and in fairness, the authority themselves, given that they were given inadequate legislation to do that job, to be in a sufficiently strong position to actually carry out that mandate. I would say, and we were very critical of their establishment precisely because of that, that had they been properly armed, then I think they could have done. If we had a real policing authority, like, in fairness, Mick had put in legislation twice to properly arm a genuinely independent policing authority, which would mean breaking that link with the Minister, particularly at Commissioner level, that had that been set up, then I think it could have gone the next step further. But I think there'd be a view, including amongst senior Gardaí even, that actually the policing authority were doing a pretty good job, given.
But we would argue that they will continue to do so as PCSOC, and that the context of legislating for that presents a perfect context for those kind of insights to be provided for in legislation. If there are deficiencies in the authority legislation now, they can be corrected when legislating for a Policing and Community Oversight Commission.
Not if you've given half their functions to an internal
it's not half their
board and a
functions.
different
It's not half their functions. Their primary function is oversight. The primary function is oversight. That's our view.
I suppose, but as I say, there's a difference between oversight and accountability. And what it's been, they've been quite good at oversight, but on Garda Síochána being held to account has been lesser success, I suppose. Like, you know.
Yeah.
Just in terms of Justice Charlton's view, structures, or maybe you haven't read the report, or no?
No, I mean, Charlton's argument, I've read more about the report than the report itself, but Charlton's argument about structures, the culture is the problem, and it's not just about structures. If it was only about structures, then we shouldn't have this problem. Of course, we don't disagree with that. We don't suggest it's only about structures. That's not an argument for not changing the structures. Like, our view is that it's holistic. It's about culture, yes, absolutely. We're very clear on that. And in fact, in the issues itemised by Kathleen at the beginning, culture is the first one mentioned. But equally, structures have to be addressed as well. It was part of our terms of reference. But by no means would we say, if you deal with these structures, everything would be right. We'd never say that. That wouldn't make sense.
No, I suppose I was just saying, it's like, why is the culture so bad, do you think? Is it not linked to the fact that people were appointed by their friends, like that incestuous internal sort of relationship, I suppose, where internally, without scrutiny, they were allowed to do whatever they like, We were the Commission on the Future of Policing. We didn't, we're aware, obviously, we all have our own views on, what is the reason for where we are, but our task was not, in fact, different to Charlton and indeed others. Our task was not to examine the past, it was to map a future. But we all bring an awareness of the past. Believe you me, we all bring that awareness to our job, but it's not necessarily our job to comment on that, I don't think.
But I think it's important to underscore that we certainly don't look at a model ahead where the Garda Commissioner or the Garda senior team would tap their friends on the shoulders and appoint them to positions. Any process going forward for appointment and promotion should be professional and legitimate and fair, and it should be supported by whether it's a public appointment service or a similar entity, so that the process is legitimate. I mean, it's a huge blow to morale if people think that a promotion and appointment process is not legitimate.
Ryan, did you want to make a further comment there, I thought?
Well, the point I was going to add to it, if you look at the things that most influence culture, I think we have addressed all of those, and they do feed to the point that that Kathleen's making there, is about the recruitment of the right people, the proper training of those people, the proper performance management of those people, proper objectives being set, and if you have a good performance management system, then you use that as a means by which you promote or you decide on promotions. And I would think that's a gap at the moment that definitely has to be strengthened. And that is one of the key things that can change culture.
I suppose just so very briefly on the security issue, and maybe I misunderstood the lateness of the error, but the independent examiner under the security bit, is that different than the coordinator?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That would be a position that would oversee.
And where does it fit in? Because, like who's the boss or who? Because reading it, you'd think that the coordinator really only can call a meeting, and sure, the lads can say, "Oh, sure, I'm not going," or whatever. Like, you know, it doesn't seem to be empowered to really do a whole lot. Like, is the examiner got that power?
Yeah, no, the examiner is based on the equivalent model in the UK, which is typically a QC. You know, a legally trained person who would make the assessment and report to the Prime Minister in relation to those matters. So it is it's an independent officer who would make a call on those questions, and you know, the normal guarantees of independence would clearly need to be put in place for that, and they would have access to all sorts of material and documents that wouldn't be generally available to other scrutineers or overseers of things. And we actually met with we met with two former holders of that position in the UK. The current holder has just become the DPP in the UK, Max Hill, and David Anderson, and I can't remember the name of the other individual that we met, but we had lengthy encounters with them about how their powers and functions worked and how they were exercised, and it seemed to be a fairly effective mechanism. And, you know, they're high-profile people who take very independent stances as to the rights and wrongs of things that they're tasked with examining.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much for coming in. I mean, obviously we are, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's long been sought by the Garda inspectors in their excellent reports that could be brought in. As I said, the GSOC suggestion, whether you agree with the name change or not, it's neither here. All the other stuff has been long demanded, and there is a desire to go and move in on a lot of this stuff as well. So we had to concentrate, I suppose, on the points that we need more clarity on, and they will be teased out further as we go. But thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. And just lastly, myself, and particularly to yourself, former chair of the Commission. You know, I noted from the preface, the foreword to the report that you prepared, that you had, as a Commission, you had met with senior government leaders, is the phrase that's used. I'm asking in the context of implementation, which is this tome to rest on a shelf and nothing to happen, would be not only disrespectful to the work done and the effort applied, but it would leave us in a very, very poor position for many years to come. I think it's important to note that across the members' contributions, there was an acknowledgement of agreement and acceptance of a great body of the work. Not all, and some of that has been highlighted. But there is a definite welcome and endorsement of very much of what you have recommended in the future of policing in Ireland. So when you indicated we met with senior government leaders, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because what my concern is, you know, in your closing remarks, you talk about if all of these recommendations are implemented, we believe that Irish policing will not only regain the ground it has lost compared to other policing jurisdictions, but will be at the forefront in the evolution of policing internationally. We're all political players, not only in this institution but in this state. And one of the things we all know very well is the unfortunate silo nature of government. I listened to Peter earlier, and he was focusing in on at the time, in relation to the other agencies of the state that have a responsibility to step up to the plate. That isn't currently the case. 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, doesn't deal with the variety of mental health issues, child welfare issues, et al. And the Gardaí are invariably the line of contact and the first responders in many of these situations, not necessarily of their particular expertise, but some would have acquired considerable expertise through experience and improved training, et al. But can you give us any indication from those that you've met, who are not specified in the report, that it's more than just a Justice Department consideration, that the Department of Health, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and any and all of the others that would have a role, a responsibility in ensuring the implementation of the situation, of the new reality that we want to see. If you could just give us a sense of that, and do you, as this is your last engagement in this capacity, exiting from this stage, have you a confidence in relation to the implementation of the report? Have you a confidence that it will overcome the silo mentality that has dogged governance in this jurisdiction all through the years? Can you give us a sense of your expectations?
Thank you, Caoimhghín. Yes, I think our engagement process, our public consultation process, our consultation process with other government departments and agencies was very robust, and necessarily so. Because policing can't be left to the police alone. As I mentioned earlier, more than 80% of what police do has nothing to do with law enforcement. It's addressing community needs and the needs of those who are the most vulnerable in those communities. So we only develop successful policing strategies if we work in multidisciplinary approaches. So we worked our consultation process around that, and we engaged with many other government departments, and indeed got submissions from many other government departments. In our reports, in our records, we've provided a list of all the departments and all the people we did engage with, and we also are now in the process of publishing, with, of course, the appropriate redactions that are necessary under the law, all of the submissions we received. And I think those who review those will have an appreciation for the very broad spectrum, the broad input that we did receive. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have spent the last year and a half working on this initiative if I didn't truly believe there was an appetite for change. For me, to some extent, it was unfinished business, because when I left here as the chief inspector, I was frustrated. I thought we had put a lot of great ideas on the table, and I thought that, that government at the time became, I suppose, necessarily distracted by the economic crisis, and police reform was placed on the back burner. But it became apparent in very recent years that something had to be done, and this is the time to do it. And this commission had no agenda whatsoever but to get this right, and we worked hard to get it right. And this report is a reflection of what we heard from the people, people in this building, and people that live and work in communities throughout the country. So, and when you say government leaders, I mean, maybe I use that term broadly, but we met with all of the parties, We also encountered many of your colleagues out at public meetings that we did throughout the country. The Caoimhghín was very nice to host a reception so that everyone from both the Oireachtas and from the House and the Senate could come and meet and express their views to us. We accepted written submissions from most of the parties. So, you know, I hope that most will see that our work is a reflection of their input and their feedback. And I think tonight we heard that again. You know, while there are still some questions and required clarification, that's a good thing. We appreciate the opportunity to be here. But in the end, I'm very heartened by the response. In fact, I didn't expect it to be as universally positive, the response is universally positive as it has been. I was also heartened yesterday to attend a meeting with representatives of 8 departments who've come together now in the early weeks following the publication of our report to determine exactly what it will take, what each of those departments will have to contribute in order to get this done and to work collaboratively in a multidisciplinary approach to implement this report. And for me, it was reassuring because when I worked on patent in Northern Ireland, we had to wait a year or two before we saw any progress because of the political state at the time. But thankfully, you know, people seem to be really digging in and following up very, very soon after the publication of our report. So, as I say, I wouldn't have spent all of this time. I don't think my esteemed colleagues would have spent all of this time unless we believed that it was a very important time, that we could make a significant contribution, and that it would be received and implemented. So I'm very optimistic.
Well, look, that's a good way to end your contribution here this evening. I am heartened to hear that there were so many departments directly involved in that most recent engagement. I think it's important that it's recognised and accepted across the board that the implementation of what is recommended is not just a responsibility for the Department of Justice and Equality. And if we are to see real change, I think a number of governments and a cross-government embrace is going to be absolutely required. And that will mean fundamental changes in the employment reality and the arrangements for employment of people who have particular skills and expertise, who are not part of policing, but who should be first responders post 5 o'clock in the evening and at weekends, and no longer depending on the Gardaí and a Garda vehicle to intervene. It's no longer acceptable, absolutely out of the question. So I'm going to take the positive from that. I'm going to thank you especially for your leadership of the Commission and its work, that you've come here this evening to engage with us as a Justice and Equality Committee. We're also 11 members, and I was listening with some interest as to, you know, there was not at all time unanimity, and just to share with my colleagues the next report we'll have next week, I was finalising with our clerk earlier, well yesterday and again today, a report that we'll be hopefully adopting next week that won't have unanimity either. We have been very lucky with a lot of our reports, but one that we're certainly not going to be able to sign off on a unanimous basis. We'll have a different set of recommendations. So, you know, our respective roles have mirrored in some regard. So, to thank you and to wish you and all who have served on the Commission, first of all, the gratitude of all of us and all we represent, and to wish Peter Fahey, Kathleen O'Toole, Helen Ryan, Donnacha O'Connell, and all who gave service on the Commission the very, very best of good luck for the future. Goramila Mahikov. The Joint Committee, you'll be glad to hear, is now adjourned until 9 a.m. on next Wednesday, the 14th of November. Gora míle maithagah.